I know, I feel like I should. Welcome back to the House Healthcare Committee. So we are going to finish up our day with, we use first names, so I'm just going to say first name, Joe from the Judiciary Committee, to talk to us about S36, which is a bill that Judiciary has taken, does touch on healthcare. So we want to do a flyby. Eric's here to answer the legal questions of it. And then there is a section that is a study that I'll touch on as well at the end. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. For the record, my name is Joe Andriano. I'm the representative for the Addison-Rutland District. And as the chair said, I'm here to talk about S36. We're currently operating on draft 2.1 of S36. And I will note that we had some additional discussion this morning on it, and there are some additional changes, and I'll highlight what we talked about this morning as well. So S36 is an act relating to permitting an arrest without warrant for assaults and threats against healthcare workers and disorderly conduct at healthcare facilities. So when you look at section 1 of the bill, this was something.
I'm going to stop you right there.
Yep.
Sorry. So if it's on the Judiciary Committee webpage.
We have it on our.
Oh, it's on our page?
Oh,
You guys are way ahead of me. Okay, go ahead, Joe.
So section 1 is interesting because this is something I had never seen before, which is instead of modifying a statute here or amending a statute here, we're actually amending a rules of criminal procedure. So Rule 3 of the Vermont Rules of Criminal Procedure has to do with arrest without a warrant. So there are certain situations under which a law enforcement officer may arrest someone without a warrant. And one of the areas where typically law enforcement officers are not allowed to arrest without a warrant is what's called a non-witness misdemeanor offense. And to be clear, we're talking about whether the law enforcement officer witnessed that misdemeanor, not whether another person, a citizen or whatever, witnessed that misdemeanor. So did the law enforcement officer actually see? So in general, a law enforcement officer can't arrest someone in that situation. However, there are a number of exceptions. And so one thing that this bill proposes to do is to add, and you'll find this on page 2, starting on line 3 of page 2, it will add sections 18, 19, and 20 to the Rules of Criminal Procedure 3, to highlight the fact that a person who's committed a misdemeanor that involves an assault against a healthcare worker or someone providing emergency medical treatment is something that can be arrested without warrant. Number 19 is about criminal threatening, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment because that's further talked about in the bill. Or number 20 having to do with disorderly conduct. And one thing I want to highlight in particular about number 20, looking at line 16, is that the disorderly conduct statute says fighting, violent, or threatening, but also has this word tumultuous in it, which we were like, what does that even mean? Yeah. And we learned that it means sort of being maybe a bit out of control or something like that. And it was felt by the Judiciary Committee that like wasn't what we were going for here, that someone sort of acting out of control, is different than fighting or being violent or being threatening. So we specifically didn't include tumultuous behavior as part of this for that reason. Do you want me to just go on or pause for a question? Okay.
Go, pause the question. Go ahead.
Well, I'm an ignoramus about the law. And probably watch too much TV, but I thought that police officers could arrest someone if they were doing a crime. And I'm confused about where the warrant fits in this situation, or that situation as opposed to this situation.
And I want to also remember, when we say the word warrant, it is different from the warrant we were talking about earlier today on S47, right? That was for mental health warrant to be able to.
So the judge to say it's legit.
Right.
Okay, so what does a warrant mean in this case? Maybe that's what I need help with.
Yeah, so I thought the exact same thing that you thought until I started learning about this bill. Was I thought that if someone committed a crime, you arrest them. I mean, hey, the person assaulted someone, why shouldn't they be arrested? But it turns out that they can't without getting a warrant, which means sort of going to a judge and saying, Judge, here are the reasons why I need to arrest this person, and the judge signing off on it and saying, yes, I agree, you need to arrest this person. Is that accurate, Eric? I'm pretty sure. Okay, good. Just wanted to double check. But so that would be the process presently with regards to these offenses that we're talking at here. And so what we're trying to do is remove the warrant from that, the need to go to a judge for something.
So
Like
in the
that.
current state, if I may, someone's in the emergency room, they're assaulting a worker, a police officer has to subdue them, but can't arrest them without getting an okay from a judge? Is that how it will go?
Yeah, and that opens a bit of a can of worms, but I'm happy to get into that can of worms. And this really touches on healthcare stuff. One thing that we learned in our testimony is that a person, when they are in a hospital, are subject to a number of laws that I'm sure you all know far better than I do. So CMS regulations, something called EMTALA, is it?
Oh, yeah.
EMTALA.
Yeah.
So there's all these regulations and laws about how someone needs to be treated inside a medical setting.
A patient?
A patient, excuse me, a patient, yes, thank you. That is a very
patient.
important,
A patient.
yes, a patient is, excuse me, that's a very important distinction and misspeaking on my part. So a patient is treated in a medical setting. According to the testimony that we heard, it can be considered to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Coercive for a police officer to be present when someone is a patient in a medical, it could be seen as, well, the doctor wants you to get this treatment and the cop's standing there looking at you like this. Are you going to, if you don't really consent, are you going to deny? And so that creates this, is part of the problem of this situation is when can a police officer actually intervene? And that gets even worse if you're in a situation where someone might be being violent and that person needs to be subdued. Because again, why is that person violent? Is that person violent because they have a medical condition that is expressing itself in that way? Well, that's different than a person who is choosing to be violent. The one person has a medical condition that needs treatment for that violence. The other person is a jerk and needs to be arrested. And so that was an important portion of all of this. And really a lot of the work that we did in the Judiciary Committee is trying to ensure that a patient's rights are respected. And not only their rights are respected, but that also the law is being followed when it comes to this. So I feel like I haven't answered your question because I feel like I forgot the other part of your question because I was sort of going down that rabbit hole to explain it. So if you just remind me.
Well, I think the distinction between patient and not patient, so that's
Yep.
important.
Yep.
And that in current state, they can't arrest someone they can't subdue someone without a warrant.
So in the current state, as my understanding is from the testimony received in the Judiciary Committee, in the current situation, a police officer could not subdue someone in a healthcare setting because of this CMS and EMTALA stuff without making an arrest. Because when an arrest occurs, according to the testimony we received, it's almost like then there's two people at this point. There's the person who is under police custody and there's the person who is being treated in a medical setting. And so that patient at that point could be subdued as a person under police custody without having to go through the emergency restraint procedures that are in the various healthcare laws. That's part of the reason that's part of the problem that led to this bill is that as we heard in testimony from healthcare providers is some testified that they're picking up the phone and calling 911 and asking people to come because they may need something to happen here. And the police saying, hey, we can't arrest the person. I'm sorry, we can't respond right now because we have other things we need to be doing. And since we can't really do anything, we're not going to show up. That testimony was countered by some other people who said that the police are showing up and doing something. So there is some disconnect between the testimony we received. But the real purpose of this is to make clear that if a person is committing these acts and that person is a patient in a healthcare facility, then they can be arrested for it, which means that the police officer could undertake those coercive measures in order to prevent the person from continuing to cause harm.
All right, Bobby and then Alyssa.
Well, I just wanted to clear up some of the things that Leslie was asking. If a police officer does witness the assault, they don't need a warrant to make an arrest. They can just arrest somebody, right? That seems like pretty basic, right? I'm just making sure.
That is correct.
Okay.
And also, I would say, if you look at the top of page 2, line 1, you'll see that one of the current exceptions to the warrant requirement in a non-witness misdemeanor offense is simple assault. And so presently, according in particular to the Defender General, stated that this bill, at least this section of the bill, doesn't actually change anything of current practice. He felt that this bill highlighted things that are important for law enforcement officers to know, that, yes, you really can arrest people in these situations and spell it out for everyone so everyone's on the same page. But that presently, because simple assault is an exempted misdemeanor from the warrant requirement, then they probably could arrest people right now.
Would it be fair to say that if this is the unwitnessed
Yes.
misdemeanor thing? So is it almost like extending the power of the police witnessing to the healthcare worker? Sort of like deputizing the healthcare worker?
No.
To be a witness?
It's just that, if you imagine a police officer shows up. So if we look at page 1 and look starting at line 12. So 911 call, there's a patient in our hospital who just punched a nurse in the face, which unfortunately happens fairly frequently. Police officer responds. Police officer then has a conversation with the witnesses there, what happened. And then they have to determine if there's probable cause that that person committed the offense in question. If the police officer at that point says, yes, I believe there's probable cause here, that police officer has 2 options. They can either issue a citation, well, really 3 options, they could just do nothing, or they could issue a citation to that person and say, you are cited to appear in court for your simple assault, or assuming that we pass this law and everything, or they can just say, I have probable cause to arrest you at this point, so I'm taking you into police custody.
So that's the operative thing that this would change. Right, okay.
Exactly. In particular for criminal threatening and for disorderly conduct, because again, under number 14, which is line 1, simple assault is already one of the exceptions here.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Oh. Did you have a question?
I did.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I have forgotten the word now, but what was the word that you used that you eliminated?
Tumultuous.
Tumultuous. Yes.
Cartwheels down the
Like
hallway.
you said tumultuous and an immediate situation came to my mind, which is, aren't you eliminating like somebody just tearing up their room?
What's interesting, Eric, what do you
I
think?
mean, isn't that what tumultuous, I mean, you're not making a direct threat towards unless you like throw the bedpan at the nurse or something like that. But if you're just acting in a completely tumultuous rage, you're still a threatening behavior, but you're not meeting the requirements of violent or threatening behavior.
That's a good point. I would defer to legislative counsel on that.
Eric Fitzpatrick with the Office of Legislative Counsel. It all depends on, it's such a word that's open to interpretation that, could that sort of behavior give rise to a fear of a reasonable person's safety? In other words, could it be threatening? Could it be that level of conduct that caused someone to generally fear for their safety, so that it rose to the level of either a threat or a reasonable fear for one's safety, which can sometimes constitute simple assault? Maybe. But on the other hand, if it's just property damage, then yeah, potentially then that person, again, as Representative Andriano was saying, doesn't mean they can't be cited to come into court and charged with the crime. Just means they can't be arrested and removed from the scene necessarily.
Go ahead, Devin.
I was just going to
Can you
add,
introduce yourself?
Devin Green, Vermont Association of Hospitals and Health Systems. I was just going to add that it is a pretty broad term, and when I brought it up with clinicians, they went off on a tangent of what is tumultuous? I don't understand. So I think there isn't much lost in striking the term, because I think they're more concerned with the threatening behavior.
Mark?
I would second that. That's not the question I had, but we work with tumultuous patients on a daily basis, including things getting thrown, and we have other avenues we can follow by which we wouldn't need the police to come. but my questions were, can you describe the varying levels of assault, simple assault, and what's next? And then in the context of an emergency room patient who was arrested but still needed treatment, did you hear testimony about what happens next? And can you describe that?
Yeah, and that was what we spent most of our time on. I'll just start with that because I'll have to defer to Eric on different levels of assault because that's not something that we took up. So to answer your other question, we'd have to turn to page 5, excuse me. Yes, page 5, starting on line 8. So the challenges, as you just sort of pointed out, is that someone may be acting in a violent manner, but that person may not be ready to leave the emergency room because they need a continued level of care. And so that was a big thing that we struggled with because we wanted to ensure that patients' rights are being respected in that situation and their need for medical care is being respected in that situation. Which is why in section 3, which is section 18A3, starting on line 8 of page 5, we tried to craft a process by which the person would not be removed from a healthcare setting or a hospital unless certain things occurred. So starting on subsection A, which starts on line 10, so when a law enforcement officer, I'm going to read the new language because we actually worked on this morning. So it's when a law enforcement officer responds to an alleged crime committed by a patient at a hospital. So essentially we want to take out the words and potentially arrest the patient for, because we were like, what's a potential arrest? Like, that's not really a thing. So we felt that, a law enforcement officer responds to an alleged crime committed by a patient at a hospital. A couple things have to happen. One thing that has to happen is that the law enforcement officer can then have, an authorized representative of the hospital can disclose to the law enforcement officer information sufficient to confirm whether the patient is stabilized so they can be removed, along with any other information that'd be necessary for purposes of safely taking custody. And also, number 2 is we want to make explicit, even though from testimony we felt it was very clear this couldn't happen anyway, we want to make absolutely explicit that the patient, the officer shall not remove a patient from the hospital until an authorized representative of the hospital informs the officer the patient, or they can't remove it if the person is not stabilized, has not been evaluated, or is awaiting transfer to inpatient care. So to really put restrictions and guardrails around if the officer chooses to arrest, the only way they can then remove from the hospital setting is if the person is stabilized. If the person is stabilized is really what it comes down to. So if they're not stabilized, not yet evaluated, or awaiting transfer, they can't go.
Then a law enforcement officer would be stationed with the patient, as often happens in the inpatient world. And does this protected health information, an authorized representative, does that square with HIPAA?
Our understanding is it does, but I'll defer.
Yes, so this is why we put the requirement to disclose protected health information to the law enforcement officer. We had heard one of the reasons that they weren't coming to the hospital was they were worried about liability, because if they remove someone who's not stable and something bad happens, it will be on them. The hospital was in a bind because HIPAA prohibits them from disclosing medical information, including the fact that they're discharged. And so we are putting this in here so that the hospital, having one of the exceptions to HIPAA is if the law requires disclosure, then you can do it. And so this is requiring disclosure to law enforcement to allow that smooth transfer and get away from that disconnect.
Do you mind if I ask Devin about my question about whether then a law enforcement officer stays with the patient?
Yeah, what happens then?
I think the law enforcement, I think it probably depends on the situation and the resources of law enforcement and, how quickly the patient can be stabilized and all of these other things. So I think it will be up to the discretion of the law enforcement officer and the information that they receive about the patient's health.
But Alan, I know you have a question. So part of the reason for this bill, right, and correct me if I'm wrong, is because there's a lot of violence against healthcare workers in hospitals, and police weren't necessarily consistently coming in because they didn't feel, for whatever reasons. This now, the question is, will require them to come at least in these situations.
So there's always, Devin Green, Vermont Association of Hospitals and Health Systems, there's always law enforcement discretion. We can't take that away. But in talking to law enforcement, they all say, we know rule number 3 by heart. It's a bit of a policy decision to say, just like domestic violence, which falls under rule number 3, we are putting emphasis on workplace violence for healthcare workers.
Okay. Thank you. Alan?
Joe, I might have missed this, but I mean where you've taken out the word facilities and just hospitals. What about other care units?
Yeah, we had some discussion and testimony around why this was really only a hospital situation. If I might just sort of defer to you again, that why we sort of made that distinction.
Sure, thank you. Devin Green, Vermont Association of Hospitals and Health Systems. So I will just say a lot of the worst testimony came from hospitals, and there was talk of narrowing it to emergency departments. I think that was something advocates would feel comfortable with, but when we looked at it further, there are instances that happen on other units, mother baby units. We actually, and if if someone goes to an x-ray from the emergency department, are they in there? So we kept it at hospitals and EMS responders, because we heard testimony from those folks as well.
And that ends up sort of being the second part, that's a great segue to subsection B of section 3 of the bill, which is that all that same stuff applies to EMS.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Great.
I was going to continue on, I'm going to return to section 2. So I'll stay on section 3 of the bill at this point. So we have some definitions under subsection C. On the top of page 7, which is the definition of the term stabilized, we had a little discussion about that today, and I really wish I could read my handwriting. That'd be helpful at this point. Eric, do you remember what we were going to do with top of page 7 there?
Yeah, I think you were going to add, to be clear, that it's a medical condition, so that for no material deterioration of the person's medical condition.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And we were also going to add EMS to that as well.
Okay.
So that ends section 3. I'm just going to do 4 and 5 because we're there, and I'll return to 2. 4 is a report on de-escalation. Big change there is a Scrivener's error, where it currently says an annually on that date for 5 years thereafter was supposed to be in section 5, not section 4. So that's being updated in the next draft.
I do want to hold
Yeah.
right there real quick. So this is, do you want to talk about 265? And
Sure, I had, some advocates had approached me, some healthcare advocates, not the office of, some healthcare workers, about introducing a bill that's based on a federal OSHA-related bill that involved VOSHA, and in further conversation with stakeholders, it didn't make sense with the current processes in place in the state and with hospitals to involve VOSHA. They don't usually address this sort of thing at the ground level. They may have some rules and laws, but they're not the ones that show up at the hospital usually. So we just took part of that bill that I introduced,
which is on our wall,
what was the number again?
265.
265. I took part of it out and worked with stakeholders to get the language in section 4. So it involves the healthcare worker stakeholders that want to be at the table in doing further planning around this issue. So that's how we came up with Section 4.
And I did reach out to Vermont Program for Quality in Healthcare, and they are comfortable with the language and doing the work.
So what does 4 do? Are you going to talk about?
Yeah. So Section 4 is a report on de-escalation. So it's basically providing a report on, what's the training about de-escalating these violent situations? What's the situation on, sufficient staffing levels? Assessing visitors and patients for aggressive behavior, all this stuff because again, there's violent behavior because someone is having a medical situation that's causing them to be violent. There's violent behavior because you're a jerk. And so how do we de-escalate people, who are beginning to experience violent behavior? Right now, we're sort of asking the police to help with that, which is reasonable. But there also could be things around using de-escalation techniques so the person doesn't become violent, they're becoming upset. How can we work with that person so they are not going to become violent? Are there sufficient staffing levels with regards to, hospital security, maybe taking care of some of these things? An assessment. So like when someone comes in, whether it's a visitor or a patient, are there things we can do to make sure that they're, are there red flags that's popping up with that person? The person's really agitated or something. They can look at that. So it's basically just looking at globally, how can we try to reduce violence in a healthcare setting without having to, resort to the police. Of course, they'd still be available if that happens, but if we can sort of stop it before it happens, it's even better.
Was there a sense, and you know this, Mari, probably better than anyone, how many violent people are patients versus people who have come in and not really patients?
Like family members or whoever's with the patient.
I think that's a complicated question. We had, testimony that a lot of folks who are becoming violent are those who are discharged and refusing to leave. We have testimony about patients, and we've also had testimony about family members. So I think this report will help us figure that out. Okay. I'm just curious.
Yeah. It is an issue, and it got worse during COVID.
Just for numbers, UVMMC has reported 700 incidents in the last year.
And I'll just speak anecdotally. I had surgery done in the fall, and I'm sitting in pre-op, and I think it was code black they kept on saying, just over and over and over again. I'm like, ask the nurse sitting there, what's code black? She's like, oh, that's when someone is not acting the way they should be, is how she put it. But it was constant. I mean, to the point where I was like, what's going on? So it is, that's an anecdotal thing, but on that one day I was in pre-op, I heard it so many times that I actually ended up asking the nurse about it.
Great.
Joe, you keep using the term healthcare setting. And previously you talked about limiting it to the hospital. I guess I have two questions. Why limit it to the hospital if you're using the term healthcare setting? And does it apply to these express care places that are around now?
So I've been using healthcare setting for two reasons, because I'm misspeaking after the end of a long week, but also because of the EMS element to it, because it is hospitals and EMS. So I should probably be a bit more specific and say that. We originally used the term healthcare facility, which was a broader term. And the decision was made to limit it to the hospital. Let me see if I can see in my notes here what our reasons for doing that was. There was a reason, I know that much, which is good. Let's see. Eric or Devin, if you remember that testimony as I scan my notes here real quick.
Unfortunately, I was also not there at that
Okay.
time. So I was told afterward to make the change, but I'm not positive what the reason.
This was this was a suggestion from the healthcare advocate, I think out of concern of wanting to ensure patients sought care, I think, and, you know, the healthcare advocate can follow up on this, but the thought was that other facilities could turn people away, hospitals can't, EMS can't, and so that is why it was hospitals and EMS.
And I also found my note as well. So this was from Mike Fisher's testimony, part of his suggestions for the bill. One of the issues he flagged is where should this be applied? And he said, this is not a quote, this is just my paraphrase, that every single witness that our committee heard was from either an emergency department or EMS setting, and so it should be restricted to that setting. And we respected his expertise and everything like that. But again, there was this issue of, well, you're being moved to the X-ray out of the and you're coming back to the emergency department. So that's why the larger term hospital was chosen. But Mike was the one who was concerned about it being healthcare facility very broadly.
We did, sorry, Devin, again, we did also hear from the Alzheimer's Association, and they were worried that this would be applied to people with dementia who were acting out, which happens with dementia sometimes. So that was also, you know, in nursing homes or in places that they live, so that's why it was reduced to hospital.
So, what happens to the people that work in those other healthcare facilities? Are they just left out in the cold, or does nothing happen there?
I mean, so I would say that, as the Defender General noted, technically, still simple assault is something that is arrestable without the law enforcement officer witnessing it. So if an assault was to happen in one of these other settings, it wouldn't have to be, it doesn't matter it was in a healthcare setting or not in a healthcare setting. Anytime you have a simple assault, that can be an arrest without the law enforcement officer witnessing it. But your point is well taken, and that is a policy choice. And, you know, I would be more than happy, you know, if your committee wanted to bring that feedback, I'd be happy to bring that feedback back, because I think we heard from Mike Fisher and he expressed these concerns, and the Alzheimer's Association, they expressed these concerns, which is why we switched it one way. But if you all feel it should be the other way, I'd be very happy to take that feedback back to judiciary, and, you know, we can try to figure out what's best. Because I'll say, for my part, I see your point. Like, you know, I definitely see your point there, which is that, are we leaving those who might be in an urgent care, which operates as an emergency room light sometimes, you know, people might go there and because they don't want to go to the ED for whatever reason, or other healthcare settings. I mean, you know, you go to your primary care physician and perhaps become violent because you're mad that you can't get some test for 10 weeks that you need. And so you become mad and you act violently. So I think your point's well taken. And if you want me, I could bring that feedback back.
Well, I have a question that is related to the fact that there's a lot of discretion involved in this. And whenever you have discretion, you have discrimination possible. And so did the Office of Racial Equality at all testify at any of that part of this?
They did not testify. That's a wonderful segue to the final section of this bill. So if we look at Section 5 of the bill, this is going to require on or before January 15th, 2024, and annually for every 5 years thereafter, a report from the Department of Public Safety. So it's my understanding that this language actually comes from that office and other statutes that have to do with that. And the discussion around this section was very much focused on equity and racial equity. So a big part of the conversation we had is this question of, how do we know who the police are being called on? And we can only know that if we have the data. And so this morning in our discussion about this, on page 8, line 6, we proposed adding, instead of where it says on arrests pursuant, adding on responses and arrest pursuant, because the discussion was you need to know the universe of all calls, or at least all police responses. We found out that we can't know all calls for some reason from the Department of Public Safety, but we can at least know how many responses. So that provides us the universe of police responses to a healthcare setting. And that would, because as you can see on line 8, that includes demographics, which also, Eric makes me realize we have to take out the word arrested from line 8 because it could be arrested or responded to, since we're going to include responses. But so then we would know what's the demographics of people who have responded to by police. And then what was the demographics of those arrested? And that, because there's demographics about all this stuff, we can then look at that and say, wow, it turns out that the example that was used in committee this morning, people that don't speak English or for whom English is a second language, let's just imagine that showed up as, wow, there's a really big spike in that. So maybe that might end up informing us about how we need to look at this law, readjust this law, or maybe do some sort of study, looking at some of these issues around de-escalation. Maybe it has, something to do with, failure to communicate because of a language barrier that's leading to the violence. So it can sort of ultimately inform us if there are demographic reasons for some of these responses or arrests.
So this is basically equity oversight built into this bill.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question. Go ahead.
Sorry, just to add on to the equity oversight, we'll also be doing that in the Section 4 report. That language says that everything will be looked at with an equity lens. And we'll be collecting that data as well for both victim and perpetrator, because we have heard from a lot of victims who are people of color or LGBT plus.
So I'm curious with the study in number 5, and I know this could not be something we want to put out there, but will we collect the data by hospital service area? So we know if there's more problems in other parts of the state than another?
So I can check on it. I'm not sure if law enforcement has the ability to do that, but like I said, we will also be collecting data for Section 4, so we can sort of cross-check.
Okay, and to Topper's question, will type of facility be reported in any of this? So like they could get a call from something that isn't a hospital, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So
I mean, I would just add it if it's available, type of facility, type of healthcare facility. Maybe to get to the point, are we seeing issues in places besides hospitals? And then we would have to do something. So, I mean, I would want FOS to weigh in on that so you can think about that, Devin. Leslie?
So I just want to be clear on sort of what we're being asked to do. I can maybe give recommendations to the Judiciary Committee. Is that what we're being?
Yeah, so we're looking at not like the type of arrest, not the type of assault or, whatever. Just the policy of, in my eyes, keeping healthcare workers protected while also ensuring the patient is getting the care they need.
So I did find Mike Fisher's testimony about facilities, and I don't know if you think that might be useful or not.
So I think for now, if you're comfortable with adding it into the report, do you want to hear Mike Fisher's testimony as to why he wanted it to just be hospitals and EMS?
Well, the fact that he did, I think maybe it could be sent to us.
Yeah, it's in there. It's a simple, I could read it in a very short time. It just says, should be limited to hospital emergency departments and first responders, and broad application of warrantless arrest to all healthcare facilities concerns us due to the variations of de-escalation training and variations of appropriate supervision to those making the decisions to call the police. So that was his concern.
That was Mike Fisher's concern?
Yeah.
And I just got a text from Mike that the Office of Racial Equity did testify in Senate on this. So.
On this issue?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that kind of answers my
Hi,
question.
Mike.
Hi, Mike.
It's over here.
I'm sorry. Well, halfway through, you were reading fast and I.
You
didn't-
are very fast.
It says, what he wrote was the broad application of warrantless arrest to all healthcare facilities concerns us due to variations of de-escalation training and variations of appropriate supervision of those making the decision to call the police.
Yeah.
So then he says the HCA has no objections to the sections on assault and criminal threatening. However, we find the expansion of warrantless arrest to disorderly conduct in healthcare settings to be problematic. The definition of disorderly includes vague and subjective behaviors, two of which seem not even to be applicable in the healthcare setting. So that was that section.
So can you just send that to everyone, please?
Yeah.
That would be great. All right, is there anything else in the bill?
There is section 2, which I skipped over. I guess what I sort of want to know though, would you like me to bring back as feedback the desire to relook at the question of hospital versus healthcare facility?
I think I would like it to be at least requested in the report if it's available.
Okay.
So that we can see if there's a problem. I mean, we've heard there's a workforce violence problem in hospitals. You had a whole legislative breakfast on it, and there wasn't anyone there from a non-hospital setting. So are you comfortable with that? Maybe they bring back the report and then we see if we can always do something next year.
I just want to make sure that if we're talking about protecting healthcare workers, that we protect them. We don't protect a third of them.
Right.
Or half of them.
Yep.
I want to piggyback on that. I don't know what the equity part has anything to do with this. We need to protect the healthcare worker. Plain and simple. Do something wrong, you need to be restrained or arrested or whatever. You know, we let these people, I just find it incredible we let them do it. So that's my.
So that's what we're trying to do here.
Let me flag it for discussion.
Okay, that'd be great.
I think it's.
Just ask you a question before you go on. Does this include the psychiatric hospital up on the hill? Is it called a hospital?
Vermont Psychiatric Care Hospital.
So it includes them?
I don't know the answer to that question. Let's see, hospital is defined, it does?
All
Okay,
of them,
yeah.
yeah.
Yep, so yeah.
So, I'm sorry, everyone spoke at once. Devin?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, I defer to Devin.
Is Brattleboro Retreat a hospital? Or is the Brattleboro Hospital a hospital for that area?
Well, Brattleboro Retreat is also a hospital.
So it
Psychiatric
includes that.
hospital.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you, Joe.
great, thanks.
All right, section 2.
Section 2. So section 2 is the criminal threatening section, and this had been previously adopted. And if you'll see, in subsection F of criminal threatening, which starts on line 11 of page 3, talks about how if you threaten a public servant, a politician, something like that, it's a 2 years, no more than 2 years in prison and not more than a $2,000 fine. And so this section expands that to healthcare workers. So if you look at the top of page 4, which is new subsection G, it says that, the person who violates subsection A of the section with the intent to terrify or intimidate a healthcare worker because of the workers, we're taking out the word previously or previous, so because of the worker's action or inaction taken at the provision of healthcare services shall be imprisoned not more than 2 years or fined not more than $2,000 or both. So it adds an enhanced penalty for threatening a healthcare worker because of their action or inaction. And this was as a result of testimony that we heard of healthcare workers being harassed in the grocery store because someone didn't like the fact that when their family member was there X number of weeks ago that they did or didn't do a thing. And so they see them in the grocery store and they start threatening them. Also heard testimony in the emergency department of the lives being threatened of healthcare workers. So that's wrong. And we want to make it really clear how wrong that is.
Great. So Devin, I just want the committee to hear your overall thoughts, Roz's position on the bill as it stands right now in the judiciary.
As it stands, we support the bill. We really appreciate the House Judiciary's work on this. They've done a really thorough job of hearing from all parties, and we appreciate the support. We think this bill provides this sort of policy decision of making healthcare, workplace violence a priority, as well as clarifying regulations, laws, procedures around it. So thank you.
Any questions of anyone? So really, we're not taking possession. We can provide some feedback. You know, if we saw some big red flag policy issues, like we could say, hey, we want possession. But with VAS, happy with this, with VPQHC, good with the language of the study, Mike Fisher. I would not want to say we need possession because that will hold it up. And as we get to the end of the year, it has to still go back to the Senate for, you know, so you get to a point where there's just not enough time. And I would like to see this. What is the effective date? Is it July 1st or?
That's a great question. On passage, yeah.
Passage. So I'd like to see this in to protect our healthcare workers and then, you know, come back to what we may need to come back to next year.
Do we need a vote or is that straw vote?
We can do straw vote if we want. We don't have to. We can.
What was the judiciary committee's vote?
They have not voted it out yet.
Didn't vote, yeah.
They're looking for any policy recommendations we have prior to their vote.
So before we do that, Madam Chair, what are you going to bring back to your committee?
So I was going to ask you that. That's going to be my final question for this committee. But so far, what I have written down is this question of hospital versus healthcare facility, and whether that should be changed generally or just sort of incorporated into the report. And the second piece was in the Section 5 report. Can we add the type of facility and the hospital service area to the information that will be in that report?
Right, because getting to the type of facility might help us get to where all this stuff is happening. I'm sorry, Alyssa first and then Bobby. She's been, I tend to forget her over here.
I'm like, raised my hand.
They're sticking their nose out.
No, I just wondered, we were talking about who supports it. Was there anybody that came in that just like absolutely despised the whole bill?
Maybe not despise the whole bill, but when Mike Fisher testified this morning, he said that he was testifying both on sort of his behalf and also sort of for Jack McCullough. And he said that the disability, was it the mental health or the disability law? Was mental health, thank you. The mental health law project at the Vermont Legal Aid has concerns. Those concerns were not fully laid out by Mike this morning, but yes, there are concerns there. Let me also take a look at my notes here from additional folks that we may have spoken to that had concerns. I definitely know that was a very, very, very big one. Let's see. Defender General. But Defender General was sort of like,
Yeah, this is not.
he was like, this doesn't make any difference. And so do it, you know, and his reasons for that is the Defender General feels that the current way that the Vermont Rules of Criminal Procedure are laid out covers it already. And so he's like, yeah, you can do it. It highlights it, but I don't see this making a difference.
So can I ask about that?
Sure.
If that's the case, then what's the problem? Why isn't it being done? Well, I mean, how does this move it along?
Well, so, and Devin can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like it seems like one aspect of it is perhaps misunderstanding or miscommunication, where it is not 100% clear perhaps to law enforcement in all situations that these are arrestable, non-witnessed misdemeanor offenses. So by highlighting that, and we heard testimony from multiple law enforcement officials that this is something that they memorize. And so this will be something that's in their head that like, this is a thing that I can arrest for. There was also the fact that, just going back to the bill here, it does expand it a little bit, right? Because if we look on page 2, line 3, that talks about misdemeanor assault. But there's additional things we're adding. So if we look at the criminal threatening, which is line 9 of page 2, that also becomes an arrestable misdemeanor offense. And in section 2 of the bill, we expanded the enhanced penalties for threatening a healthcare worker from just politicians to a healthcare worker. Also, you know, looking at line 15 of page 2, the disorderly conduct aspect of it is also added to it. So it just highlights these different areas so everyone is on the same page. It also adds this on page 5, starting line 8, it also adds this clear procedure for if law enforcement makes an arrest in the circumstance, exactly when can the person be removed from the healthcare setting, so.
Bobby, Melanie, Topper.
Well,
I'm sorry, I forgot Alyssa again. Bobby, Melanie, Topper, Alyssa. Sorry, you're still going last.
this is going back a bit. There's a little while ago, you said that hospitals are different from another, like a clinic, for example, a doctor's office. Because the hospital has to accept everyone, whereas a doctor's office can refuse.
You haven't said that, but yes.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yes. I'll adopt her testimony.
Well, what I'm asking is that, I mean, and that, just for clarity, that's like where you see the sign saying we reserve the right to refuse to serve a steady customer kind of thing. A hospital can't do that. Is there a legal term for that?
I'll defer to Devin.
Well,
My
it's
co-witness.
EMTALA. So EMTALA requires hospitals to accept everyone.
Yeah, okay, but that doesn't apply to like a doctor's office or urgent care facility. Okay, and so that's what the
It's
question.
not hospitals, so it's ERs, right?
It's emergency departments,
So
but
making that distinction,
yes.
it's ERs.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, okay. So this is why, so presumably the reason why hospitals are the only things included in this bill is because they already have the ability to turn someone away.
I think that the reason why it was changed from healthcare facility to hospital was due to the testimony of Mike Fisher and his concerns and him pointing out that we actually didn't have testimony that showed that this was a problem outside the hospital setting.
So we saw earlier today, we had testimony about unwitnessed action initiating response by law enforcement. And there was a discussion about like the documentation that needs to happen afterwards in the signed affidavit. Is there stuff that's embedded in this because we were being asked about that today and the discussion, I was curious about that piece of it for this law or this bill.
I think it just stands on whatever the common procedures of the law enforcement is, and we didn't go over any of that.
Which is different than what we're talking about with mental health.
Okay.
Yes, they're two different processes.
Great, thanks for that clarification.
Yeah. Alyssa, say Topper so nice to you.
I really just wanted to know, I should have asked this a while ago, but is there anything in this bill that protects patients where the violence is attributable to their medical condition?
Yes.
So that they're not arrested, essentially.
That's the rub here. And that's sort of what we spent a lot of time thinking about, is that you have someone that may have a medical condition that is causing the behavior. Dementia it could be a mental health problem, it could be many, many, many different things that's causing the behavior. So how do you deal with that problem? And what this bill does do in order to try to protect those folks is in that section 3 of the bill, which is this idea that the hospital will provide information to determine if that person is stabilized, and if they are stabilized, what sort of continued care they would need if they were to be removed by the law enforcement officer and sent to corrections, for example. And we heard from Representative Oliver, who is a law enforcement officer, that corrections won't accept a patient who came out of a hospital setting without discharge papers showing what the ongoing care is needed. So that aspect is worked in here. The other aspect that's worked in here is at the bottom of page 5 is this idea of just making explicit that the patient shall not be removed unless they're stabilized, and making that really, really explicit. It's my understanding that Devin can correct if I'm wrong, that there's additional layers of protection here as well, which is this EMTALA stuff and these CMS standards that, give patients various rights when they are in a hospital setting that we didn't talk very much about, except to the extent of having some testimony and better understanding that this law needs to fit into the grander scheme of these other laws protecting patients.
Yeah.
I'll say, I see where you're coming from.
I'm just thinking of somebody with like advanced dementia, they can be clinically and medically stable. And their violence is being caused by the dementia, which is probably not the reason that they're there. I mean, I just want to make sure that we're not arresting people with conditions that are causing them to be violent.
I can't imagine us, sorry, doing that.
That's exactly where I went.
I know, but, you know, somebody could get fed up and just.
That's where I went too. I mean, like, I have the same, it's such a hard.
But it's likely that someone like that would already have a diagnosis of dementia on their problem list, so that would be a known quantity. So it would have to be taken into account in an evaluation. Couldn't, I mean, I'm spending my time thinking about blood sugars. If if someone came in with a blood sugar of 1,000, but that would, and they're off the wall because their blood sugars, we don't want them arrested.
And there would be there'd be a team of healthcare providers working with that patient. So that I think the whole team would have input about whether or not this was a case that would lead to arresting the patient. And I just can't imagine a scenario where that would happen.
So what about a scenario, and I'm sure you thought through this, is it?
Sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Friday.
Where we have I go in and I'm in the midst of a psychotic episode. I have decided I am afraid to take my medication, or maybe it's a first episode psychosis situation. And I'm not connected to care yet. It's first episode, right? So I don't have a psychiatrist. I don't have a diagnosis. I end up in the emergency department because I'm like our earlier person walking out into traffic. Mm-hmm. And someone gets me to the safest place nearby, which is the ED, unfortunately. And I'm waiting and waiting and waiting for 3 to 6 days. And they can't get me a psychiatrist to do the assessment and intake anywhere. There's no bed available. And I begin shouting and becoming disruptive in the emergency department and, verbally abusive. I noticed that legal aid pointed out something about, being verbally disruptive or something. And did you address that concern?
That's tumultuous behavior aspect of disorderly conduct that we were looking at earlier. Yeah, so what we did in disorderly conduct, part of the definition of disorderly conduct, and that is page 2.
Before we go too deep into it, yes,
yep.
It's addressed, yes.
Yes.
Okay, and so now I'm in the ED, I'm still waiting for a diagnosis. I cannot be admitted to care even if a bed opens up. And I'm becoming violent. Then, if someone needs to remove me because I am violating this statute, then I'm taken into police custody and it becomes a criminal case, right?
Mm-hmm.
No. Because if you're waiting for an evaluation, that is taken care of in this language. It says you cannot be removed if you're awaiting evaluation or inpatient transfer or you're not stable.
Okay.
But you can be arrested still. You can be arrested in the custody of police in the hospital setting, and you can be cited. So it is possible that the police officer could show up and cite you for that crime and say, I'm not gonna. It doesn't make sense for me to wait around, doesn't make sense to arrest in this situation. There's that discretion of the law enforcement officer, but they could choose to do nothing. They could choose to cite, they could choose to arrest. If arrest is the choice, then they would not be able to remove from that hospital setting unless that person is stabilized. And so that means, according to the language we have here, it means they can't be waiting for an evaluation, they can't be waiting for a transfer to an inpatient level of care, and they can't be not stable. They have to be stabilized, and there's that definition of stabilized in the statute.
So I would be potentially awaiting EE for involuntary order of hospitalization or medication. And then we go back to a different bill.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And how it all ties together.
My question's
Thank
easy.
you.
Your question's easy for
Yeah.
sure.
I just want to make sure this report that you talk about in section 5 is going to actually happen. Department of Public Safety said they could get the information that's needed here from the local police.
I will double,
Responded to the,
we can double check on that. This all came out of the Senate, that last final section, that section 5. So if you'd like, I can double check and see about the Senate side of it, if they got that testimony and everything. But it seems like Eric, you want to answer that question?
That actually was not in the Senate bill.
Oh, it wasn't?
No,
Oh, okay.
it was put downstairs.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Yeah.
Representative Owens' request.
Did you remember anything about?
They're not clear on whether they're gonna be able to get
Okay.
that information. They're gonna they were gonna look into it, and I think particularly, anyway, I'll follow up with you on the respondent too. I'm almost sure they would be able to get that, so yeah, that's where that came from.
So
I
that's,
think that's crucial to this bill.
It is, yeah, yeah.
and I would also like to add that we receive a copy of the report, please.
Yep,
Oh, great.
yep, let me add that.
That we want.
Get a
We
copy of
receive a
the,
copy of the report. We're in the first one, but we're not in the second one.
I think it's worth noting that the Office of Racial Equity is opposed to this bill. We need to put that, and if that's a problem, we need to address that. I mean, I understand Art's concern saying equity is not an issue in this, but I was just thinking of an analogy. Sorry, Melanie, I'm only picking you because you're sitting right next to me. If Melanie goes into a hospital and bangs her fist on the table saying, I demand, treat, my child gets treated a certain way. One thing might happen. If I were in the same hospital and did the exact same thing and beat the counter with my fist as hard as I could, I might see a different response.
Yeah.
That's just a fact.
Yeah.
So we have to
And we've
consider
seen that
that.
in schools and with like restraint and.
And I completely understand that, and I think that's why this last study is really important. But I think some of the context that we're missing in this committee, because I'm not sure everyone went to the legislative breakfast. And we haven't heard directly from the healthcare workers who have been severely traumatized by what's happening to them. So it's a good balance, right? And so let's protect them and let's get the data that we need to ensure, and let's ensure we come back to it next year. So I would say we will want to know whether or not Department of Public Safety can get this data moving forward. So we won't take any straw vote or anything today.
so how does that work out then, in terms of how we communicate to judiciary?
Joe takes our questions back and they will.
Because the straw poll, that someone's gonna say, did you run this by healthcare? And you'll just say yes, and there wasn't a straw poll, and that'll be that.
Well, I'm not saying we're not going to do a straw
I do
poll,
at some point.
we're not doing one today.
Got it.
I would like to get these answers.
Okay, I get it. So you're saying that he's gonna come back with, or someone, or.
Yes.
Yeah.
Got it. So if I may,
Can I say one thing, just because I don't want to minimize what Alyssa and Daisy were saying, because I think there's the rub. Like what you were just saying is the rub of this entire bill, which is, what about patients' rights in this situation? What about a patient who is experiencing a medical situation that is causing the behavior that is violent? And that is the hardest part of this bill, and figuring out that balance. And that's sort of part of the reason I'm here, is because of that part of the discussion, that being sort of more of a healthcare thing, it's judiciary, but it's also really healthcare. And so that's part of the reason I'm here is that element of it, because I struggle with the exact same thing. I mean, it's horrifying hearing the stories of healthcare workers. It's absolutely horrifying. At the same time, jail is not the setting for someone who is experiencing a medical condition that is causing them to behave in a particular way. And yet we need to protect the healthcare workers and we need to protect the patient. And that balance is incredibly hard. And I think that's part of the discussion here. It's a lot of what we had in judiciary, but I think it's very fairly a healthcare discussion as well. Like how do you strike that proper balance? And you're right. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Joe. And I think what's harder is finding someone who has been in this situation and had this experience and can come sit here and say, thank you, that helped me.
Mhm.
I have yet to see that happen.
I think there's a second rub, and the second rub is the equity rub. So, because healthcare workers deserve protection. At the same time, people deserve to be treated equal, with equity. So I think we have to look at.
Yeah, it's not an easy bill.
So that's why I think there's two levels. It's that level and then it's that level. And we have to be able to do both.
I also want to apologize for my earlier comments about the concern about patients with dementia and that I couldn't imagine a scenario like that. That was really narrow-minded of me, and
No, because
I
I
think
believe
I-
that 99.99999% of the time you're right. I'm just thinking of somebody who's having a bad day and it's like punched in the eye for the fourth time and it's like, I've had it.
with a dementia
Yeah.
patient, patients with dementia.
But like,
And I really appreciate, Bobby, your statement and Daisy, your concerns as well.
I understand what you're doing and I agree with this, okay, when we see the fact, but we're never there's always exceptions to the rules of everything we try to accomplish. So somewhere we have to back up the professionals and the experts to do the right thing. So that's.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to say I appreciate Bobby's statement as well, because I know from my own life that I have been in privileged situations before in the healthcare setting and being able to demand things and speaking to friends who have been in similar situations who have not gotten the same care. I've seen it happen in my own life, unfortunately. And so I agree, equity is critical because we need to know, to whom is this bill being deployed on? And that's a really, really important question.
So you or someone will get back to us probably early next week.
Yep, for sure. Great.
Time to hear from you. Thank you, everyone. It's so good to have you back.